Millionaire's laughter echoed off the marble walls like a whip crack in a chapel. "So you think you're smart?" he said, gesturing mockingly toward the woman polishing the glass conference table. "Then translate it." Richard Blackwood's voice rang through the grand atrium of Blackwood Industries, smooth as silk and soaked in venom. "Prove it," he sneered, holding up a thick contract. "Translate this into Mandarin for all of us." Around him, 15 suited executives burst into laughter, their smug faces twisted with cruelty. Some pulled out their phones, eager to film the spectacle. A rich man's idea of breakfast entertainment. Camila Santos, 34, froze. The cloth in her hand dripped onto the gleaming floor, but her eyes, steady, unsettlingly calm, locked on the man who had just tried to reduce her to a joke. She said nothing. "Take your time," Blackwood continued, casually adjusting the platinum Rolex on his wrist. "I know it must be difficult for people like you to understand complex documents." His tone was full of practiced arrogance, the kind passed down like fine china in certain families. Laughter erupted again, louder this time. Camilla didn't flinch. She had heard worse, and she had endured far more. What they didn't know, what none of them bothered to learn, was that Camilla had once been one of the most promising minds in her field. A magna cum laude graduate in applied linguistics from Harvard, fluent in 7 languages, specializing in legal translation. She had stood on the cusp of a brilliant future, academic publications, embassy offers, a fast-track diplomatic career, until a single false accusation had destroyed it all. Plagiarism, they said. The irony was almost too bitter to swallow. The man who had accused her, Dr. Marcus Blackwood, Richard's own son, was the one who had stolen her work during her master's thesis. A middling intellect, a charmer in expensive loafers, Marcus had sensed he was about to be caught, so he reversed the roles before the truth could surface. "Dad always said diversity is important," Marcus had muttered in front of the review board on that unforgettable day. "But some people just don't have the background for this level of academia." Those words still burned in Camilla's memory, their sting as fresh now as they were then. Yet here she was, 2 years later, cleaning the very building named after the man who had humiliated her. Silent, invisible, until now. For 2 years, Camilla had mopped the floors, wiped down the walls, and when no one was looking, translated the confidential documents executives left behind. Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, Japanese, languages they assumed she couldn't possibly understand. She had been their ghost, collecting fragments, decoding a darker truth that seeped through every memo and spreadsheet. Systematic overbilling, offshore laundering, falsified revenue reports. Blackwood Industries was an empire built on polished crime, and she knew exactly where the cracks were. Her silence now was not hesitation. It was strategy. "Some people need to know their place," Marcus said, strutting into the room with the smugness of a man who thought he'd already won. "Diversity has its limits, doesn't it?" More laughter. Camilla glanced at James Mitchell, the CFO, who was filming with the glee of a schoolboy. Sarah Thompson from HR smirked beside him, clearly enjoying the show. And then Camilla moved. Without a word, she took the contract from Richard's outstretched hand, her fingers precise, deliberate. Her eyes flicked through the first pages with lightning speed. And then, with a clarity that pierced the room like the first note of a requiem, she began to speak. In perfect, flawless Mandarin. The laughter died instantly. You could have heard a heartbeat echo. "This contract," she translated, her voice calm, unwavering, now switching seamlessly to Portuguese with crisp articulation, establishes a joint venture between Blackwood Industries and Louis Holdings, a Chinese conglomerate. Interestingly, Clause 47 allows Louis Holdings to take majority control if they detect financial irregularities in any American subsidiary. Richard Blackwood's face drained of color. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. That clause had been buried deep, Page 187 of a 200-page document, written in complex legal jargon few Western attorneys could parse, let alone a cleaning woman. Fascinating coincidence, Camilla continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of someone who had finally stepped into the spotlight she had earned. I'm sure the Securities and Exchange Commission would be thrilled to learn about the fabricated revenues you've reported from non-existent overseas projects, especially when those projections were designed to inflate shareholder value for your Chinese investors. The cleaning cloth slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a damp thud, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. Once, the executives no longer looked amused. Their expressions had shifted from smug superiority to creeping fear. Camilla stood there not as the target of mockery, but as the woman who had been playing a long, quiet game of chess while they fumbled with checkers on a stolen board. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Camilla raised her hand. The gesture was so natural, so commanding, that the billionaire instinctively obeyed and fell silent. "Oh, and Marcus," she said, turning to face him, her eyes narrowing. "That article you published last year on syntactic structures in Sino-American legal translation? Brilliant piece, especially considering I wrote every single word of it, 3 years before you even knew that field existed." What happened next would be remembered not just as a scandal, but as a seismic reckoning on Wall Street. 3 weeks after the now infamous translation incident, Camilla was still cleaning the same floors at Blackwood Industries. But everything had changed. Now, people avoided eye contact. They whispered when she passed. The looks she received weren't of superiority anymore. They were of unease, and something else. Fear. Richard Blackwood, clinging to the remains of his crumbling ego, had begun spinning a narrative among his inner circle. He told them that Camilla had memorized a few phrases in Mandarin to impress people. It was a weak, desperate lie, and he knew it. But it bought him time. Time to strategize, to assess the threat she now posed. Marcus avoided her entirely, scurrying away like a guilty schoolboy. Her presence had become a living reminder of everything they had tried to bury. What they didn't realize was that Camilla had turned every shift into a covert intelligence operation. Each morning at 6 a.m., before the building filled with employees, she had access, real, unchecked access, to unlocked offices, discarded notes, coffee-stained drafts of confidential memos. The trash was a minefield of secrets. Shredded documents half-pieced together, forgotten passwords scribbled on sticky notes, outlines of merger talks that hadn't gone public yet. Every scrap of paper told a story. And she was building an archive of truth. It was during one of those early mornings that she met David Chun, a quiet man in his 50s who had worked as an internal auditor at Blackwood for 15 years. He was already at his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee, when Camilla entered with her mop and bucket. Unlike the others, David stood up, offered her a seat, and even poured her a cup. "I heard you speak Mandarin," he said, watching her organize the papers on his desk with meticulous care. "My grandmother was born in Guangzhou. I always meant to learn it, never had the time." Camilla smiled for the first time that morning. She knew then that David wasn't like the others, and she suspected that, like her, he had been quietly keeping score for years. What came next would shake Blackwood Industries to its core, and this time, the cameras would catch more than just humiliation. They would capture the downfall of a dynasty built on lies, and the rise of a woman no one saw coming. Camilla noticed something in David's tone that day, an unusual candor that stood out in the carefully curated coldness of Blackwood Industries. Over the following weeks, their casual conversations became more revealing. David had seen irregularities in the financial reports as well, but every attempt he made to dig deeper had been systematically blocked by Richard himself. "There's something very wrong with the Hong Kong subsidiaries' numbers," David confided one morning, ensuring they were alone. "The contracts I'm sent to audit don't match the reported revenues. It's like there are 2 versions of everything." That was the moment Camilla knew she had found an ally. Hien. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood escalated his campaign of subtle humiliation. During executive meetings, he peppered his monologues with jokes about employees who watch too much YouTube and think they're fluent in foreign languages. He instructed Linda, the secretary, to assign Camilla extra cleaning tasks, always accompanied by condescending remarks about people who didn't know their place. Marcus took things even further. He began leaving complex documents in Arabic and Russian on her desk with mocking notes. "Since you're so smart, how about translating these two?" It was his twisted way of testing whether public humiliation had finally broken her spirit. What Marcus failed to grasp was that Camilla translated every document meticulously, uncovering details about phantom joint ventures in the Middle East and suspicious operations in Eastern Europe. Each cruel provocation became another breadcrumb in the trail of evidence against his own family. The true turning point arrived when David, now fully trusting Camilla, handed her a flash drive late one evening. "I kept everything," he whispered, his voice strained. "Backups of the original financial reports, before Richard doctored them. I knew one day they'd be necessary, but if they traced the leak back to me..." His voice trailed off. "They won't," Camilla assured him, her eyes reflecting a quiet fire. "Do you have a family?" "A wife and 2 young children." "Then leave this to me. When it's over, you'll still have your job. They won't." That night, Camilla worked until 3 a.m. in her modest apartment, cross-referencing the data from the translated documents with the files David had preserved. Slowly, methodically, the puzzle began to take shape. Blackwood Industries had constructed a sophisticated web of shell companies across at least 6 countries, using fake contracts to move funds and report fabricated revenues. Schemes designed to dazzle Chinese investors with the illusion of explosive growth. But the most damning revelation was Marcus's involvement. He had leveraged his academic position to validate some of the fraudulent operations, penning technical opinions that lent scholarly legitimacy to Richard's financial manipulation. Camilla's plan had 3 meticulously crafted phases. The first, gathering irrefutable evidence, was nearly complete. The second phase involved reaching out to contacts she had cultivated during her time at Harvard. Investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, and compliance officers she once knew in the days before her career was derailed. But the third phase? That was her masterpiece. 1 week before the Chinese delegation was scheduled to arrive to finalize the $500 million deal, Camilla did something that shocked even David. She volunteered to help organize the event. Linda nearly choked on her coffee when she received the request. "You want to work extra?" she asked, skeptical. "I need the money," Camilla replied with rehearsed humility. "And you'll need all the help you can get with international guests." Richard personally approved the request, gleeful at the opportunity for further mockery. "Let her work then," he laughed. "Let's see how she handles real Chinese executives." What Richard couldn't possibly imagine was that Camilla had already spent 2 weeks in direct communication with Louis, the CEO of the Chinese corporation. Their correspondence, conducted in flawless Mandarin, was not between a janitor and an executive, but between a seasoned compliance expert and a potential investor concerned about financial improprieties. Camilla had introduced herself not as a cleaning lady, but as an independent international consultant with insider knowledge that could compromise the deal's integrity. As she polished the marble floors of Blackwood Industries on the eve of its most important event, Camilla smiled quietly. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, confirmation messages from multiple sources. Everything was in place. Richard and Marcus Blackwood were hours away from learning a painful truth. They had underestimated a black woman with a Harvard PhD in linguistics, a mind like a steel trap, and an unshakable thirst for justice. What they didn't know was that Camilla wasn't just playing a game of chess. She had designed the board, arranged the pieces, and lured them into a checkmate they never saw coming. The Grand Crystal Hall at Blackwood Industries had never seen such pomp. Louis and 5 of his top executives occupied the main table as Richard Blackwood strutted before them, beaming with confidence. "As you can see, Our growth in the Asian market has been exponential, he declared, gesturing toward the screen filled with colorful graphs. Your partnership with us represents the next phase of global expansion. Marcus sat nearby, his smirk widening as he watched Camilla serve coffee to the Chinese guests. To him, it was the perfect image, the uppity cleaning lady finally back in her place. That illusion shattered seconds later. Louis stood and approached Camilla. Miss Santos, he said in perfect Mandarin, silencing the room. I'd like you to explain the discrepancies you identified in the financial reports. Richard went pale. Marcus's pen dropped, clattering on the table like a gunshot. Camilla straightened, no longer the invisible cleaner, but a woman fully in command of the moment. Mr. Louis, she replied in elegant Mandarin, as we discussed in our previous emails, I found at least 12 serious irregularities in the documents your team received. She has no authority to... Richard began. Silence, Louis ordered. Camilla activated the projector, replacing Richard's presentation with her own slides. The first image displayed two versions of the same financial report, one inflated, one real. The Hong Kong subsidiary reported revenues of $80 million last quarter, Camilla explained. Internal documents show actual revenue was just $31 million. That's a $49 million discrepancy in fraudulent statements. Marcus leapt to his feet. That's invasion of privacy. She never had access. You left those documents on your desk, Camilla replied coolly, assuming a cleaning lady wouldn't understand them. The second slide showed translated contracts in Arabic and Russian. These outlined shell companies in 6 countries used to launder funds and fabricate revenue. And you can prove these documents' authenticity? Louis asked. Absolutely. Camilla connected her phone to the room's audio system. Richard's recorded voice filled the space. The problem is the Chinese are very detail-oriented. If they find inconsistencies, the deal will fall apart. We need to dock the numbers before we send the final report. Richard lunged forward. That was taken out of context. Just then, David Chun entered the hall, carrying a box of documents. The audit Miss Santos requested is complete. All original versions are here, including the backups. Traitor, Marcus roared. You've worked for us for 15 years. I did, David said calmly. My resignation letter is on your desk, along with my report to the SEC. Camilla presented the final blow. Emails authored by Marcus, instructing universities to validate the fraudulent operations and use academic credentials to give them legitimacy. Not only did you defraud investors, she said, turning to Marcus, but you corrupted institutions of higher education to cover your tracks. Louis nodded toward an assistant who immediately began photographing every document. Louis Holdings has a zero-tolerance policy on fraud, he said. We would like to offer you a position as our U.S. compliance director. I accept, Camilla replied. But one final note. She turned to the stunned Blackwoods. For 2 years, you humiliated me, assuming that a black woman couldn't possibly grasp your schemes. But every time you dismissed me, you handed me another piece of your own destruction. Richard made a last-ditch attempt. No one will believe the word of a former cleaning lady. Louis chuckled. Miss Santos is not a former cleaning lady. She holds a PhD in linguistics from Harvard. We verified her credentials before our first exchange. Camera flashes erupted as journalists swarmed. 2 federal agents stepped forward. Richard and Marcus Blackwood, one agent announced. You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. This can't be happening. We're the Blackwoods, Richard shouted as the cuffs snapped into place. Camilla stood still, her face serene amid the chaos. 2 years of silent humiliation had become a moment of absolute justice. Yet, even as the Blackwoods were led away, one question lingered. Was this only the beginning of the transformation Camilla had envisioned? 6 months later, the world had its answer. Standing in a hot couture blazer, Camila Santos gazed from the 40th floor of the newly renamed Santos Louis International Holdings. Manhattan stretched before her like a living testament to what had been reclaimed. The transformation was astonishing. Under her guidance as Chief Global Compliance Officer, the company hadn't just survived the scandal, it had flourished. And somewhere, buried in her encrypted files, were more revelations. Camilla knew she had only just begun. Chinese investors, deeply impressed by Camilla's integrity, strategic brilliance, and quiet resilience, expanded their initial investment to a staggering $800 million. The result was one of the most powerful Sino-American partnerships the industry had ever seen. On a crisp Wednesday morning, David Chun, now newly promoted to Chief Financial Officer, knocked gently on Camilla's office door. He entered with a thick file of quarterly reports and a beaming smile. The numbers are spectacular, Camilla, he said, unable to hide his excitement. International operations are up by 340%. 0 audit flags. And, he paused, holding back a grin, Forbes just named us the most ethical company of the year. Camilla's satisfaction was quiet but profound. The transformation was not just financial, it was moral, cultural, and symbolic. She leaned back in her designer chair, a far cry from the janitorial cart she used to push, and asked with a raised eyebrow, "And the former owners?" David didn't skip a beat. Richard Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud and money laundering. He lost everything: mansions, yachts, Swiss accounts. He's serving time at a medium security facility in Arizona. David flipped a few pages, clearly savoring the irony. Marcus? Even worse, 12 years in prison. He was stripped of his doctorate and banned from every academic institution in both the US and Europe. Word is, he's now giving private English lessons online to survive. Camilla chuckled softly. The irony was almost poetic. The man who had mocked her intelligence, who had sabotaged her academic dreams out of arrogance and prejudice, now survived on online tutoring, barely making rent in a one-bedroom apartment. Justice had not only been served, it had been served with elegance. And Linda Carter, the secretary who once handed her mop buckets with snide remarks, fired for complicity in the fraud. Last anyone heard, she was working as a receptionist at a local dental office, earning a third of her former salary. It wasn't revenge. It was the natural reordering of a universe where integrity had finally caught up with privilege. "There's something you need to see," David said, handing her a glossy business magazine. On its cover was a commanding photo of Camilla in a tailored suit, the Manhattan skyline blazing behind her. The headline read, "From cleaning lady to CEO, Wall Street's smartest revenge." It was an 8-page spread detailing the improbable, extraordinary journey of Camilla Santos. From silent humiliation to public vindication, from invisibility to the pinnacle of corporate power. The article called her a once-in-a-generation executive who had rewritten the rules of success, proving that intellect, ethics, and relentless determination would always outlast arrogance and inherited power. That afternoon, Camilla returned to her old neighborhood, not as a visitor, but as a benefactor. She had funded the construction of the Santos Educational Center, a sprawling 3-building campus offering free courses in language training, digital literacy, and professional development. It was her personal tribute to those who, like her, had once been dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated. "Camilla has always been special," said Doña Marcia, her former neighbor, tears brimming in her eyes. "Even when she was cleaning offices, I knew that was temporary. People like her are born to lead, not to serve." Over 200 people attended the inauguration. Young Black and Latino men lined up for photos with her, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol. To them, Camilla wasn't just successful. She was proof that the game could be changed, that the rules could be rewritten. "My journey proves that our greatest revenge against prejudice is success," she told the crowd. "Every time someone tries to diminish us because of our color, our origin, or our gender, We must transform that energy into fuel. Fuel to climb higher than they ever imagined possible. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd when Louis, the Chinese CEO who had first recognized her brilliance, stepped up to the microphone with a surprise announcement. Santos Louis Holdings will allocate $50 million to scholarships in translation studies and international law, he declared. We're calling it the Camila Santos Program because we believe exceptional talent exists in every corner of society. It just needs an opportunity. That night, back in her penthouse overlooking the city, Camila sat at her sleek glass desk, watching the skyline flicker like a galaxy of ambitions fulfilled. Then the phone rang, an unknown number. She answered cautiously. Camila? The voice was broken, fragile. It was Richard Blackwood, calling from prison. I just wanted to say you were right, he said, every word heavy with regret. About everything. I'm sorry I underestimated you. She took a deep breath before answering. Her voice was calm, deliberate. You didn't underestimate me, Richard. You despised me out of pure prejudice. There's a difference. I know, he admitted. And now I'm paying for it. My family is gone. My friends have disappeared. You've won completely. No, she corrected gently. I didn't win against you. I won against myself, against everything you tried to make me believe about my worth. I turned your humiliation into the fuel for my success. That's not revenge. That's justice. She hung up, not with anger, but with the serenity of someone who had climbed the mountain they were never meant to approach. On her desk lay 3 job offers, one from the United Nations, another from the White House, and a third from a top global consulting firm offering a seat on the board. 2 years ago, she was scrubbing floors in silence, treated as invisible. Tonight, multi-millionaire executives were vying for her insight, her vision, her name. There was no sweeter revenge than building a life so grand, so unassailable, that the very people who tried to destroy you must now witness your triumph from the shadows. But Camilla knew the real lesson wasn't about vengeance. It was about transformation. Richard Blackwood believed that a black woman's place was behind a mop, not in a boardroom. He saw her as a joke, a fluke, a disposable worker. What he didn't know was that every sarcastic remark, every demeaning task, every dismissal only sharpened her will. Every insult became a brick in the empire she would one day build. Because real success, the kind that rewrites narratives, that shatters ceilings, that inspires generations, is not forged in privilege. It is born in adversity, grown through persistence, and sealed with integrity. The greatest revenge isn't destroying those who tried to break you. It's becoming so powerful, so undeniable, that they realize, too late, they were never even in your league. Camila Santos turned 2 years of humiliation into a lifetime of leadership. And that is a victory no one will ever take away. If this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more true stories that prove our greatest defeats are often just the prologue to our most spectacular victories.